The impact shook Chris's entire body as the escape pod crashed into the desert surface. Alarms blared in his ears, red emergency lights flickering across the cramped interior. His vision blurred, head throbbing from the violent landing. Through the cracked viewport, swirling dust storms obscured what little he could see of the desolate landscape. Endless sand, twisted metal ruins jutting from the ground like broken teeth. Status report. Chris coughed, tasting blood. The pod's AI remained silent. The impact had damaged more systems than he'd feared. He fumbled with his harness, fingers trembling from shock and dehydration. The air recycler wheezed pathetically, struggling to filter the thin atmosphere entering through hairline fractures in the hull. This was not how his transport mission was supposed to end. A simple cargo run between colonies had turned into disaster when electromagnetic storms knocked out his navigation systems, sending his ship spiraling toward this forsaken planet. Chris grabbed his emergency pack and inspected the contents. A half-filled water pouch, multi-tool, portable scanner, and basic medkit. Not much to survive on a hostile world. He knew the basics of the planet from briefings, one of many devastated during the corporate wars decades ago, when genetic experimentation ran rampant before civilization collapsed. Companies had created entire populations of beastkin, human-animal hybrids designed initially as specialized labor, then as soldiers. After the wars, most of these planets were abandoned, their inhabitants left to fend for themselves in the wreckage. Find water, find shelter, Chris muttered, forcing his bruised body to move. The pod wouldn't protect him for long, and night would bring plummeting temperatures. He pressed the emergency beacon, standard procedure, though rescue chances were minimal given the planet's location in unpatrolled space. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as he limped away from the crash site. Jagged rock formations rose from the sand, their surfaces scarred by ancient weaponry. The atmosphere had an odd metallic taste that burned his lungs slightly. His scanner showed dangerous electromagnetic activity, likely why his systems had failed in the first place. As dusk approached, Chris spotted an oddity among the rocks, what appeared to be deliberate arrangements, possibly entrances to underground structures. More promising was the faint smell of smoke carried on the wind. Where there was smoke, there were people, or at least something that used fire. He approached cautiously, scanner indicating complex tunnel systems beneath. A flickering light emanated from one opening, along with the distant sound of metal on metal. Crouching behind a boulder, Chris observed the cave entrance. Movement caught his eye. A figure emerged briefly, silhouetted against the dim light inside. Chris froze at the sight. Tall, powerful build, but with unmistakable non-human features. Pointed ears, a swishing tail, and what appeared to be claws. A beastkin. So rumors were true. Survivors still existed on these abandoned worlds. Weighing his options rapidly, Chris knew his chances of survival alone were significantly lower than if he could negotiate help. Before he could plan his approach, a low growl came from behind. Move and die, outsider. Chris raised his hands slowly, turning to find himself surrounded by 3 beastkin warriors, their forms blending remarkably with the rocky landscape. Their physical traits varied, one with feline features, another with canine characteristics, the third with what appeared to be reptilian scales along their forearms. All held crude but effective-looking weapons aimed at his vital organs. "I mean no harm," Chris said calmly. "My ship crashed. I'm looking for shelter and water. I can trade skills for assistance." The reptilian one scoffed. "Another scavenger from the corporations? Come to finish what your kind started." "No." Chris shook his head firmly. "Independent freight pilot. No corporate affiliation. My name is Chris." The group exchanged glances, communicating silently in what seemed like a practiced manner. Finally, the feline one gestured toward the cave. "Elder Tharn will decide your worth," they said. "If you lie, your blood will feed our land." The cave system was more extensive than Chris had anticipated. A network of tunnels with evidence of sophisticated living arrangements despite obviously scavenged materials. Makeshift lights, powered by salvage technology, illuminated walkways. Small groups of beastkin watched him pass with suspicious eyes. Some bore visible scars. Others displayed impressive technical modifications, cybernetic enhancements integrated with their unique physiology. They led him to what appeared to be a medical area, where several injured beastkin were being treated with limited supplies. One patient immediately caught Chris's attention, a female beastkin with striking black fur and piercing amber eyes. Unlike the others, who merely seemed wary, her gaze held active hostility as she watched him enter. A substantial bandage wrapped her right arm, blood seeping through despite recent application. An elderly beastkin approached, Elder Tharn, presumably, with feline features and gray-streaked fur. You claim to have skills. What kind? Engineering. Mechanical repairs. I've worked on everything from life support systems to salvaged pre-war tech, Chris answered, keeping his eyes respectfully on the elder rather than continuing to stare at the wounded female. I noticed your lighting system could use calibration. I could improve efficiency by at least 30% with minor adjustments. The elder studied him thoughtfully. Many outsiders have made promises. Few deliver anything but betrayal. I understand your caution, Chris replied. Let me prove myself with something small first. While they deliberated, Chris noticed the wounded female attempting to eat, an awkward, painful process with her injured arm. She dropped her food with a frustrated growl. Without thinking, Chris moved toward her, picked up a portion of the fallen food, and offered it to her directly. Here, let me help. The cave fell silent. Every beastkin froze, staring at Chris with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. The wounded female's eyes widened, her aggressive demeanor momentarily replaced by surprise as she automatically accepted the morsel from his hand. Elder Tharn stepped forward rapidly. You have initiated the binding, he announced, voice echoing through the suddenly silent cave. To feed by hand is to accept the lifelong bond. What? Chris looked around confused. I was just helping because she's injured. The female beastkin stared at him with an unreadable expression, her amber eyes studying him with new intensity. Ignorance of our ways does not negate the sacred ritual, the elder continued solemnly. You have fed Leela by hand, and she has accepted. By our oldest laws, you are now bound as mates. Chris's mouth fell open. There's been a misunderstanding. I didn't. The ritual is witnessed. Elder Tharn cut him off with finality. The bond is acknowledged. As murmurs spread through the gathered beastkin, Chris realized his simple act of kindness had entangled him in traditions he didn't understand and bound him to a fierce-eyed stranger who now watched him with a complex mixture of resignation and curiosity. Leela, they had called her, and apparently they were now mates for life. The days that followed were a study in cultural disconnects and grudging adaptation. Chris was assigned a small alcove near the community workshop, close enough to be watched, far enough from most living quarters to ease tensions. His promise of technical skills proved genuine. By the third day, he had already improved the efficiency of their water filtration system by 30% and repaired several weapons that had been deemed beyond salvage. The binding technique is archaic but effective, Chris muttered as he spliced together damaged circuitry in an ancient communications module. His hands worked with practiced precision even as his mind struggled with his bizarre situation. From the shadows, Leela observed him. She had taken to following Chris everywhere, maintaining a distance that was neither threatening nor comfortable. She rarely spoke, but her amber eyes missed nothing. Her wounded arm was healing well. She had refused his offers of additional help with eating since that fateful first encounter. Is watching me all day part of this mate ritual too? Chris asked without looking up from his work. Yes, came the simple reply. Her voice was surprisingly melodic despite its gruff delivery. Chris set down his tools and turned to face her. Look, I understand there's been a cultural misunderstanding. I respect your traditions, but where I come from, feeding someone isn't a marriage proposal. Leela tilted her head, black fur shimmering in the dim light. Our ways kept us alive when your kind abandoned us to die. The bond ensures loyalty during hardship. She stepped closer, examining his handiwork with genuine interest. You fix things well. I've had practice, Chris replied, surprised by the compliment. Been salvaging and repairing since I was a kid. Grew up on a rim colony that didn't have resources for replacements. Your colony? Leela asked with unexpected curiosity. Was it destroyed too? The question revealed more than she perhaps intended, a glimpse into the trauma that shaped her people's worldview. Chris shook his head. No, just poor. I left to find better opportunities. Never imagined I'd end up stuck on a planet like this. Stuck, she repeated, testing the word. You seek to leave? There was something in her tone, not accusation, but wariness. Chris realized that in her eyes, his desire to leave might be seen as rejection of the bond they supposedly shared. My ship is damaged. Beyond repair, he answered carefully. And even if it wasn't, the electromagnetic storms in this system would make navigation nearly impossible without specialized equipment. So yes, I'm stuck, at least for now. Leela nodded, seemingly satisfied with his honesty. Then you will make yourself useful while you are here. It wasn't a question. As days turned to weeks, Chris found himself gradually integrated into the community's routine. Each morning, he worked on critical infrastructure. Afternoons were spent training younger beastkin in basic mechanical principles. Evenings devoted to long-term projects like improving their defensive systems. Through it all, Leela maintained her watchful presence, though her demeanor slowly shifted from suspicion to something resembling respect. The ventilation system in the eastern tunnels has been compromised, Elder Tharn informed Chris one evening. Acid damage from the last storm. The young ones cannot sleep for coughing. Chris nodded. I'll need to fabricate replacement filters. The materials in storage should work if I modify the design. As he gathered his tools, a commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A hunting party had returned, but their triumphant calls quickly turned to shouts of alarm. They carried a wounded member, a young beastkin barely out of adolescence, bleeding heavily for what appeared to be energy weapon wounds. Overlords, gasped the injured youth as they laid him down. Patrol at the western ridge. New weapons. They tracked us halfway back before we lost them. The cave erupted in focused activity, warriors checking weapons, families gathering children, scouts dispatched to ensure they hadn't been followed. Overlords? Chris asked Leela as they helped clear the medical area. Her expression darkened. Remnants of the corporate security forces. They hunt us still, generations after the wars ended. They consider us property to be reclaimed or destroyed. The gravity of the situation became clear as Chris watched the community's reaction. This wasn't just a random threat, but an ongoing existential danger. These people lived in constant fear of extermination. As the initial crisis stabilized, Chris noticed a tall, powerfully built male beastkin staring at him from across the cave. Unlike the others, whose suspicion had generally mellowed with time, this one's hostility was palpable. Garen, Leela said quietly, following his gaze. He leads the warriors. He does not approve of your presence. Because I'm an outsider? Because he sought me as his mate before you came, she replied matter-of-factly. The elders favored the match for its strength. Before Chris could process this revelation, Garen approached, his massive frame towering over them both. His features were more pronounced than most. Heavy brow, prominent canines, muscled arms covered in russet fur ending in formidable claws. The outsider sits idle while our people prepare for danger, he growled, addressing Leela as if Chris were invisible. He repairs what your warriors break, Leela countered, stepping slightly forward. His skills have value. Garen sneered. Skills with metal, perhaps. But what are the skills of protection? Of hunting? Of fighting? He turned to Chris directly. You took the bond of mateship through ignorance and accident. You claim rights you haven't earned. Chris stood, meeting Garen's gaze steadily despite their height difference. I've never claimed any rights. I'm helping your community because it's the right thing to do. Words, Garen spat. Empty words while you hide in our tunnels. Elder Tharn appeared beside them, his quiet authority immediately shifting the dynamic. Enough, Garen. Return to your duties. With a final glare, Garen stalked away. The elder turned to Chris with a contemplative expression. The binding ritual is sacred, but incomplete, he said. If you are to be truly accepted, truly considered Leela's mate, you must complete the trial of hearts. Chris glanced at Leela, whose expression revealed nothing. What is this trial? A journey into the old places, Elder Tharn explained. To retrieve an artifact of significance to your mate's lineage. Leela's ancestral claw charm was lost when we fled the eastern caverns during the Great Collapse. You want me to go into dangerous ruins to find a family heirloom? Chris clarified. Not want. Require. The elder's tone left no room for negotiation. Without this, you remain an outsider who violated our customs, regardless of your useful skills. Chris considered his options. Refusing would likely mean expulsion, or worse. And despite himself, he had begun to feel responsible for these people. For Leela. When do I leave? He asked. At first light, Elder Tharn answered. Leela will provide what details she knows of the charm's location. The rest is for you to discover. As the elder departed, Chris turned to Leela. Did you know this was coming? Yes. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw concern there. Few return from the trial. Garen has engineered this challenge to remove you. And you're okay with that? Leela's expression hardened. I did not choose this bond, but neither will I dishonor it. The trial is your path to true acceptance. She paused, then added quietly, if you wish it. The question hung between them. Did he wish for acceptance? Did he want to belong to this place, to these people, to her? Tell me about this claw charm, Chris said finally. If I'm going to find it, I need to know exactly what I'm looking for. Leela's subtle nod acknowledged his decision. As she began describing the artifact, a curved claw set in ancient metal, inscribed with family markings, Chris wondered if he was being foolish. But when he caught Garen watching them from across the cave, naked triumph in his eyes, Chris knew he couldn't back down. Trial or not, he wouldn't give the warrior the satisfaction of seeing him fail. The eastern caverns loomed before Chris like the maw of some ancient beast. Sunrise painted the entrance in blood-red light, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. He adjusted the makeshift pack containing his tools, a water flask, and emergency supplies. The tunnel systems extend for miles, Leela explained, standing beside him at the threshold. Against protocol, she had insisted on accompanying him to the entrance. The collapse happened near the central chamber, where the old laboratory equipment remains. My family's quarters were in the northeast section. Chris nodded, committing the directions to memory. Any other dangers I should know about? The air may be toxic in sections where filtration failed. Ancient defense systems sometimes activate randomly. And there are rumors of... She hesitated. Of what? Abandoned experiments. Things created during the wars that never died. Wonderful, Chris thought grimly. Poison air, killer robots, and possibly mutant monsters. All to find a piece of jewelry that would apparently legitimize their accidental relationship. The charm bears our family marking. 3 parallel lines crossed by a 4th at an angle, Leela continued. It contains encrypted data about our lineage. It is all that remains of my ancestral record. The personal significance wasn't lost on Chris. This wasn't just about ritual or tradition. It was about identity, about preserving what little remained of their history after corporations had used and discarded them. I'll find it, he promised. Leela studied him, then reached into a pouch at her belt. She withdrew a small object and pressed it into his palm, a curved thong on a leather cord. My token. It may guide you in paths seem unclear. The gesture surprised him. Is this part of the ritual too? No, she admitted quietly. This is my choice. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her silhouette dissolving into the morning mist that clung to the rocky landscape. Chris took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness. The eastern caverns had clearly once been a sophisticated facility. Deteriorated lighting systems lined the tunnels at regular intervals, though most had long since failed. Structural supports bore corporate logos, now corroded beyond recognition. His portable light illuminated passages that branched in multiple directions, some collapsed, others yawning into impenetrable blackness. He consulted the crude map Leela had drawn, orienting himself toward the northeast quadrant. The first hour passed uneventfully as he navigated through the main corridors, marking his path with luminescent chalk to ensure he could find his way back. The air grew thicker as he descended deeper, forcing him to activate his emergency filter mask. Strange growths clung to the walls in patches, possibly some form of fungus adapted to the post-war environment. Occasionally, his light would catch reflective surfaces, abandoned equipment, shattered displays, the remnants of a technologically advanced society reduced to ruins. A sudden mechanical froze him in place. Ahead, something moved in the darkness, something metal. Chris extinguished his light immediately, pressing himself against the wall. The whirring grew louder, accompanied by the distinctive sound of servos and hydraulics. A security drone rounded the corner, its ancient chassis covered in corrosion, yet somehow still operational. A single optical sensor swept the corridor with a faint red beam. Chris held his breath as the light passed over his position. The drone paused, its processor audibly struggling with decades-old protocols. For a tense moment, Chris thought it would move on. Then its optic flared brighter, and a mechanical voice crackled through damaged speakers. Unauthorized personnel detected. Initiating containment protocol. Chris dove sideways as the drone fired, an energy pulse scorching the wall where he'd stood. He scrambled behind a fallen section of ceiling, mind racing. The drone was slow, likely operating on minimal power, but its weapons remained functional enough to kill him. Containment protocol, he muttered. Not termination. It's trying to capture, not kill. This suggested the drone wasn't military, but rather security for the facility. Understanding the distinction might help him survive. The drone advanced methodically, its single optic scanning for his heat signature. Chris quickly assessed his surroundings and spotted a damaged control panel nearby. If the drone followed original programming, it might prioritize protecting facility systems over pursuing intruders. He grabbed a piece of debris and threw it hard at the panel, creating a shower of sparks. As predicted, the drone immediately pivoted toward the perceived threat to infrastructure. Chris used the distraction to sprint across the corridor into a side passage. The drone's mechanical voice echoed behind him. Alert. Facility damage detected. Prioritizing system integrity. Chris didn't wait to see if his gambit would hold. He pushed deeper into the complex, following Leela's directions toward the residential section. The passages narrowed, designed less for efficiency and more for habitation. Personal effects littered the ground, evidence of hasty evacuation during whatever catastrophe had forced the Beastkin to abandon their home. After navigating a particularly treacherous section where the ceiling had partially collapsed, Chris emerged into what had clearly been living quarters. Small rooms lined a central corridor, each bearing signs of individual occupancy despite the institutional design. Names were etched beside doors, not in standard script, but in a modified format clearly designed for Beastkin use. He scanned the markings, looking for anything resembling the pattern Leela had described. Near the end of the corridor, he found it, 3 parallel lines crossed by a fourth at an angle, carved beside a doorway. The room beyond was sparse, but retained touches of personality. Fabric scraps in vibrant colors hung from the walls. Crude drawings depicted landscapes unlike the barren world outside. This had been a child's room, he realized. Possibly Leela's own from before the evacuation. A thorough search revealed nothing resembling the claw charm. Chris fought down his disappointment. The logical place would have been here, but perhaps it had been kept elsewhere for security. A distant crash reminded him that the drone was still active somewhere in the complex. He needed to keep moving. The next section proved more challenging. A maintenance shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders, requiring him to wriggle through on his stomach. The confined space made his heart race, but led to a promising area indicated on Leela's map. A communal space where valuables might have been stored. As he emerged from the shaft, his light revealed a vast chamber dominated by ancient technology. Unlike the residential areas, this space showed signs of violence. Scorch marks from energy weapons impact damage from explosives, and darker stains that could only be blood long-dried. This had been no mere evacuation. It had been a battlefield. In the center stood a massive piece of equipment, something like a containment unit or stasis chamber. Its surface was covered in the same corporate logos he'd seen throughout the facility. And it was active. Lights blinked weakly along its control panels, drawing power from some emergency system that had remarkably endured for decades. As Chris approached cautiously, movement caught his eye, a massive shape detaching itself from the shadows behind the machine. He raised his light, illuminating a nightmarish figure nearly 3 meters tall. It had clearly once been a beastkin, but cybernetic enhancements had transformed it into something else entirely. Part animal, part human, part machine. Its organic components had deteriorated grotesquely, while its mechanical parts continued functioning with terrible efficiency. Subject identified. Human biological. It intoned, voice a distorted amalgamation of synthetic and organic sounds. Procedure. Capture for experimentation. Chris backpedaled as the cyborg advanced with surprising speed. This was no drone. This was a combat unit designed specifically to capture subjects for whatever horrors had been conducted in this facility. I'm just looking for something. Chris tried reasoning, knowing it was futile. A family artifact. I'm not here to interfere with your procedures. The creature showed no indication of comprehension. It lunged forward, mechanical arms extending to impossible lengths. Chris ducked and rolled, barely avoiding its grasp. He scrambled behind the central machine, mind racing for a solution. Direct combat was suicide. The thing was stronger, faster, and virtually indestructible compared to his human frame. But all machines had weaknesses, especially ancient ones running on emergency power for decades. The cyborg smashed through equipment to reach him, sending sparks and debris flying. As it closed in, Chris noticed something crucial, a power conduit running from the central machine to a port in the cyborg spine. It was drawing energy directly from the facility's remaining systems. Cut the power, disable the threat. Chris feigned left, then darted right as the cyborg committed to its lunge. Its massive form crashed into the central console, momentarily disorienting it. Chris seized the opportunity, grabbing his multi-tool and driving it into the power junction with all his strength. The effect was immediate. Cascading system failures rippled through the cyborg's frame. It convulsed violently, mechanical limbs spasming as emergency protocols activated and failed in rapid succession. With a final, guttural sound somewhere between mechanical whir and organic groan, it collapsed. Chris didn't celebrate his victory. The power disruption had triggered secondary systems throughout the chamber. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashed, and ominously, the central machine began a shutdown sequence punctuated by small explosions within its housing. Whatever this machine had been containing was about to be released. Chris turned to flee, then stopped. Something had caught the light, a metallic gleam from within the cyborg's remains. Driven by instinct more than logic, he approached the fallen monstrosity and examined it more closely. There, embedded in what had once been its chest cavity, was an ornamental claw set in metal, exactly matching Leela's description, right down to the 3 parallel lines crossed by a 4th. "You've got to be kidding me," Chris muttered, understanding dawning. This cyborg had been someone from Leela's family, transformed into a monster, but still, somehow, carrying its identity token. With shaking hands, Chris pried the charm free just as the central machine emitted a final, catastrophic failure sound. The chamber began to shake, dust, and debris raining from the ceiling. Whatever had been happening here, the power fluctuation had destabilized the entire system. The facility was coming down. Chris ran, charm clutched tightly in his fist, Leela's token bouncing against his chest. The route back seemed twice as long as tunnels collapsed behind him, forces unleashed by the central machine's failure rippling through the complex's structural supports. He barely squeezed through a gap as the ceiling came down behind him, the impact sending him sprawling. Pain shot through his side, a broken rib, possibly several. He forced himself upright, each breath a new agony. The main corridor was ahead, but a massive collapse blocked his original entry path. Desperate, Chris consulted his marked trail and found a secondary passage, narrower, less stable, but potentially leading to the surface. What followed was a blur of pain, determination, and instinct. Chris crawled through spaces barely wide enough for his body, climbed over debris with hands bleeding from countless cuts, and finally, just as his light began to fail, spotted natural illumination ahead. He emerged at sunset, collapsing onto the rocky ground outside, a different entrance than the one he'd used that morning. The claw charm remained clutched in his bloodied hand, its metal warm against his palm despite the cooling evening air. For several minutes, Chris simply lay there, allowing his body to acknowledge its survival. Then, painfully, he rose to his feet and began the long trek back to the Beastkin settlement. It was well past midnight when he finally stumbled into the cave complex. Guards immediately surrounded him, weapons raised until they recognized his battered form. Word of his return spread quickly, drawing a crowd despite the late hour. Elder Tharn pushed through, eyes widening at Chris's condition. "You survived." It wasn't a question, but Chris answered anyway. Barely. Leela appeared, pushing past others with uncharacteristic urgency. She stopped short at the sight of him, her amber eyes tracking every injury, every bloodstain. For a moment, her composed demeanor cracked, revealing genuine concern. Chris opened his hand, revealing the claw charm. "I believe this belongs to your family." The assembly fell silent as Leela approached. With reverent care, she took the charm, examining its markings. Recognition flashed across her features, followed by something deeper, grief, perhaps, or resolution of a long-held wound. "This was my mother's," she said softly. "She was taken during the final raid. We never knew what became of her." Chris recalled the cyborg and chose his words carefully. "It was being kept in a secure facility. I think many of your people were taken there." Understanding passed between them. He wasn't telling the whole truth, but enough that Leela could infer what he'd encountered. Her eyes held his, a new depth to their connection. "You have completed the trial of hearts," Elder Tharn announced formally. "The bond is confirmed by courage and sacrifice." The gathered beastkin murmured their approval, all except Garen, who watched from the shadows, his expression a storm of thwarted ambition and barely contained rage. Leela stepped forward, taking Chris's bloodied hand in hers. Without waiting for further ceremony, she led him toward the medical area. "You need treatment." As they passed Garen, the warrior's growl was audible only to them. "This isn't finished." Chris met his gaze steadily, too exhausted for fear. "I found what was lost. I earned my place." Garen's eyes narrowed. "We shall see what you've earned, outsider." The confrontation might have escalated, but Leela pulled Chris away. "His pride is wounded," she explained once they were alone. "He will recover, or he will challenge. Either way, it is tomorrow's problem." As a healer examined his injuries, Chris studied Leela's profile. She kept the claw charm close, occasionally running her fingers over its surface as if connecting with a past long thought lost. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said quietly. Leela nodded. "Many were taken. Few returned." She turned to face him directly. "But something of her survived. Because of you." There was gratitude in her voice, but something more as well, a respect that transcended their accidental bond, something built on actions rather than traditions. As the healer wrapped his broken ribs, Chris realized with surprise that despite everything, the pain, the danger, the cultural disconnects, he felt more connected to this place, to these people, to Leela, than he had to anything in years of aimless drifting between colonies. Perhaps being stuck here wasn't the worst fate, after all. The days following Chris's trial brought a strange, new dynamic to the Beastkin settlement. Those who had previously avoided him now acknowledged his presence with respectful nods. Young ones approached openly, curious about his adventures in the eastern caverns. Even the more traditional elders seemed to have accepted his place among them. Only Garen and his closest followers maintained their distance, watching with thinly veiled hostility as Chris's integration deepened. With Leela's guidance, Chris expanded his efforts beyond mere repairs. He began designing improvements, more efficient water reclamation systems, reinforced defensive positions, even crude communication devices to help coordinate hunting parties. The settlement was gradually transforming, hints of prosperity emerging from generations of mere survival. "You've taught the younglings to repair the air filters," Leela observed one evening as they shared a meal, a ritual that had become commonplace between them. "Now they argue over who will apprentice with you next." Chris smiled, wincing slightly as his still-healing ribs protested. "They're quick learners. Especially Tala. She has a natural understanding of electrical systems. Her grandmother was an engineer before the wars," Leela explained. "Perhaps such knowledge lives in the blood." This sort of conversation had become natural between them, an easy exchange of information and observations that had evolved from their initial awkward formality. They still maintained separate sleeping spaces, but spent most waking hours together, navigating their unusual relationship with increasingly comfortable familiarity. As they finished eating, Chris noticed Leela seemed distracted, her attention repeatedly drawn to the cave entrance where guards were changing shifts. "Something wrong? The hunting party is late," she said quietly. "They should have returned before sundown." Before Chris could respond, a commotion erupted at the entrance. Warriors rushed to assist as the missing hunters staggered in, one of their number being carried, clearly wounded. Elder Tharn met them at the entrance, his normally composed demeanor shaken by the sight. "What happened?" The lead hunter, a stocky beastkin with striped markings, reported breathlessly. "Overlord Patrol, new weapons, advanced sensors. They tracked us from the western ridge." Keto took a direct hit. Chris followed Leela to the gathering crowd. The wounded hunter, Keto, had a severe energy weapon burn across his torso, the flesh seared in a pattern Chris recognized from military-grade targeting systems. "Did they follow you?" Garen demanded, pushing through to take command of the situation. "No," the lead hunter insisted. "We used the underground streams double back 3 times. We lost them near the Red Cliffs." Chris studied the wound pattern more closely. "These aren't standard weapons. The targeting system uses quantum locking. It's designed to track specific genetic signatures." He looked up at the shocked faces around him. "They're hunting beastkin specifically, not just patrolling." Garen rounded on him. "And how would you know such details about Overlord technology, outsider?" "Because it's not Overlord tech," Chris replied evenly. "It's military-grade equipment, far beyond what security forces would use. Someone has upgraded their arsenal." The implications hung heavy in the air. If the Overlords had acquired advanced weapons specifically designed to target beastkin genetics, the community's safety measures were suddenly inadequate. As the wounded hunter was rushed to the medical area, Elder Tharn called the settlement's leaders together, including, to Garen's visible displeasure, Chris and Leela. "We must prepare for the possibility of discovery," the elder began gravely. "If the Overlords have enhanced their hunting capabilities, our concealment strategies may be compromised." "We should strike first," Garen argued. "Find their outpost and eliminate the threat before they find us." Others voiced agreement, but Chris shook his head. "That's suicide. If they have quantum targeting, they'll lock onto your genetic signatures the moment you approach. You'd be walking into a massacre. So we cower here and wait for them to find us." Garen challenged. "No," Chris countered, "we adapt. I've seen this technology before. It has weaknesses we can exploit." The discussion continued late into the night. Strategy and counter-strategy, evaluation of resources, assessment of risks. Throughout, Chris noticed something odd. Small supplies had gone missing from inventory. Weapons, food stores, communication components, all showing minor discrepancies that individually seemed like accounting errors, but collectively suggested a pattern. More concerning was Garen's reaction when this was mentioned. Not surprise or anger, but a carefully neutral expression that struck Chris as rehearsed. Later, as he and Leela walked back to their respective quarters, Chris voiced his suspicions. Someone's been siphoning supplies. Small amounts consistently over time. Leela stopped walking, her amber eyes narrowing. "You're certain?" I've been tracking inventory since I started working on the weapons systems, Chris explained. The discrepancies are too consistent to be accidents. You suspect Garen, she stated rather than asked. Chris chose his words carefully. I noticed his lack of reaction when the shortages were mentioned. Everyone else seemed concerned or confused. He seemed prepared for the question. Leela glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Accusations against a lead warrior require evidence. The elders won't act on suspicion alone. Then we need to find proof, Chris said. If someone's betraying the settlement to the overlords, we're all in danger. They agreed to investigate discreetly. Over the next several days, Chris created a tracking system for the remaining supplies while Leela observed Garen's movements. The settlement continued preparations for a possible attack, reinforcing defenses, drilling evacuation procedures, stockpiling medical supplies, but an underlying current of tension permeated every interaction. On the third night of their investigation, Chris was awakened by Leela's hand covering his mouth. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness as she signaled for silence, then beckoned him to follow. They moved silently through the sleeping settlement, keeping to shadows until they reached an unused storage tunnel. Garen left the main cave an hour ago, she whispered. Two of his most loyal followers created a distraction at the east entrance while he slipped out through the maintenance shaft. With supplies? Chris asked. Leela nodded grimly. A pack full. And this. She produced a small device, crude but functional, obviously assembled from scavenged parts. A transmitter. Chris examined it, his worst fears confirmed. This is designed to broadcast coordinates. Military frequency. He's betrayed us. Leela's voice was tight with controlled fury. Betrayed our entire people. We need to catch him in the act, Chris said. The elders need absolute proof. They followed Garen's trail, moving cautiously through the rocky landscape under the cover of darkness. The twin moons cast just enough light to navigate without using artificial illumination that might give away their position. After nearly an hour of careful tracking, they spotted movement on a ridge ahead, Garen's silhouette unmistakable against the starlit sky. From their concealed position behind a boulder formation, they watched as he activated the transmitter. The small device emitted a faint pulse of light with each transmission burst. We've seen enough, Leela whispered. We should return and alert the elders. Before they could retreat, a new sound reached them, the distinctive hum of Overlord transport vehicles. Chris pulled Leela deeper into the shadows as searchlights swept across the terrain below. A sleek, armored vehicle materialized from the darkness, bearing the insignia of Overlord Command. The vehicle stopped at the base of the ridge where Garen waited. A hatch opened, and a humanoid figure emerged, tall, encased in advanced combat armor that obscured any features. Even from a distance, the aura of authority was unmistakable. Commander Vex, Garen greeted the figure, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. I've confirmed the settlement's location and defenses as promised. And the human? The commander's voice was distorted through the armor's communication system. He continues to improve their technology, Garen replied bitterly. They treat him as one of their own now because of the female. Your personal grievances are irrelevant, Commander Vex stated flatly. What matters is the settlement's capture. Our employers require live specimens for the new program. Chris felt Leela tense beside him. They exchanged glances, both understanding the implications. This wasn't mere hunting. The overlords were capturing beastkin for something worse. When do we move? Garen asked. Dawn. 2 days hence, the commander replied. Your reward will be as promised. Freedom, position within our ranks, and a female of your choosing once we've processed the others. Leela's claws extended involuntarily, a low growl building in her throat. Chris placed a restraining hand on her arm. They needed to return and warn the others. Engaging now would only get them killed, and the settlement would remain unwarned. With painful restraint, they backed away silently as Garen concluded his treasonous meeting. Once safely distant, they raced back toward the caves, minds racing with the implications of what they'd witnessed. He sold us for power, Leela said as they ran, her voice thick with disgust. My people, his people, treated as commodities again. The settlement has less than 2 days to prepare, Chris said grimly. We need to move quickly. They reached the caves before dawn, immediately seeking Elder Tharn. The old beastskin listened solemnly to their report, his expression growing heavier with each detail. Bring the council, he instructed a guard. And find Garen. He must answer for these accusations. But Garen had not returned to the settlement. His quarters revealed hasty packing. He had no intention of returning before the Overlord attack. As dawn broke, the council gathered. Chris and Leela presented their evidence. The transmitter specifications, the supply discrepancies, and their eyewitness account of Garen's betrayal. The mood shifted from shock to grim determination. We must evacuate, one elder suggested. Find new caves, start again. There's no time, Chris countered. And they have tracking technology that targets your genetic signatures. Running means fighting on open ground, which gives them every advantage. So we die here instead? Another council member challenged. Chris shook his head. We fight here, on our terms, with every advantage we can create. He turned to the assembled leaders. I have an idea, but it requires everyone's cooperation and every bit of salvageable technology in the settlement. What followed was a frenzy of activity. Under Chris's direction, the community transformed their home into a tactical nightmare for invaders. Every tunnel became a potential ambush point, rigged with jury-rig explosives and electromagnetic traps designed to disable the Overlord's advanced weaponry. Children and elders were moved to the deepest chambers with escape routes identified. Warriors prepared under Leela's command, her natural leadership emerging in crisis. She organized them into small, mobile units rather than a direct fighting force, guerrilla tactics suited to their environment and abilities. The overlords expect slaves, not soldiers, she told her fighters. We will show them their error. Meanwhile, Chris worked tirelessly to modify their limited weapons. Their armor is designed to resist energy weapons, but vulnerable to concentrated electromagnetic pulses, he explained as he cannibalized parts from damaged equipment. We don't have to destroy them, just disable their systems long enough to neutralize the threat. By nightfall, the settlement had transformed from a hidden refuge to a carefully planned defensive position. As final preparations were made, Chris found himself standing with Leela at the cave entrance, watching the moons rise over the desolate landscape. When I crashed here, all I wanted was to survive long enough for rescue, he admitted quietly. Now, Leela prompted when he didn't continue. Now I'm helping defend a home, he finished. Funny how quickly priorities can change. Leela studied him thoughtfully. You fight for us as if born to our clan. I fight for what's right, Chris replied. And for the people I've come to care about. He glanced at her. For you. The admission hung between them, more significant than any ritual or tradition. This was no accidental bond, but a choice, conscious, deliberate, earned through shared struggle. Leela's expression softened in a way he'd never seen before. With careful deliberation, she reached for his hand, entwining her fingers with his. Then we fight together as true mates should. The moment was interrupted by the alarm, scouts reporting movement at the perimeter. The overlords had arrived early, hoping to catch them unprepared. Chris and Leela exchanged one final look before turning back to the cave. Whatever came next, they would face it as equals, bound not by accident or custom, but by choice and trust forged in crisis. Ready the first phase, Leela commanded as warriors took their positions. Let them enter the outer tunnels. The settlement fell silent, waiting in darkness as the faint sounds of overlord forces approached. Mechanical whirs, the clank of armored footsteps, hushed tactical communications, all growing louder as they entered the trap. Elder Tharn appeared beside them, his aged face set with fierce determination. For generations, we have hidden. Today we stand. Chris nodded, activating the first set of defenses. Let's introduce them to the real beasts. The battle for the settlement had begun. The first explosion rocked the outer tunnels, triggering a cascade of carefully planned traps. Overlord communications erupted in confusion as their formation disintegrated in the narrow passages. Chris monitored the chaos through a jerry-rigged sensor array, directing defenders to reinforce positions where needed. Eastern Tunnel compromised. A scout reported breathlessly. They've brought in mining equipment to create new entrances. Just as we expected, Chris replied. Activate secondary defenses in sections 5 and 6. More explosions followed, along with the distinctive sound of Leela's strike teams engaging the fragmented Overlord forces. The Beastkin fighters moved with natural stealth through hidden passages, striking and retreating before the heavily armed but disoriented invaders could effectively respond. At the command center, a hastily established hub in what had been the community gathering space, Chris coordinated the defense while maintaining communication with Leela's teams. Reports filtered in. Overlord squads pinned down in the western tunnels. Automated defenses holding its secondary entrances. Casualties on both sides, but the Beastkin's knowledge of the terrain proving crucial. Commander Vex is leading a concentrated push through the main corridor, a wounded fighter reported. Advanced armor, heavy weapons. Our traps barely slow them. Chris had anticipated this. It's time for Phase 3. Fall back to defensive positions and prepare the EMP devices. As the defenders executed the planned retreat, deliberately drawing the Overlord forces deeper into the complex, Chris finalized the central trap, an electromagnetic pulse generator powerful enough to disable every piece of Overlord technology within the main caverns. The device was crude, assembled from salvage components, and would likely burn out after a single use. They would have one chance. A commotion at the entrance to the command center drew his attention. Two warriors dragged in a struggling figure. Garen, captured while guiding Overlord forces through a secondary tunnel. The traitor returns, Elder Tharn said coldly as Garen was forced to his knees. Garen snarled, defiant despite his captivity. You fools fight when you can negotiate. The Overlords would have taken only some. Others could have lived free. Free. Chris stepped forward, disgust evident in his voice. You heard them yourself. They want specimens. No one would be free. Better than extinction. Garen spat, which is what awaits when your clever traps fail. Outsider. A runner arrived, breathless with urgency. Commander Vex forces have breached the inner perimeter. Leela's team is engaged, but outgunned. They request immediate support. Chris's heart clenched, but he maintained his focus. Begin the evacuation sequence for the vulnerable. Activate all remaining traps along their approach. He turned to the warriors. Secure him and join the defense. I'll handle the EMP. As the command center emptied, Chris made final adjustments to the pulse generator. It had to be triggered at precisely the right moment, when enough Overlord forces were within range, but before they could reach the settlement's most vulnerable members. The sounds of battle grew closer. Energy weapons discharged, illuminating the tunnels with brief flashes of destructive light. The Overlords were pushing forward with ruthless efficiency, their advanced technology gradually overcoming the defenders' home field advantage. Chris shouldered the EMP device and moved toward the fighting. The main cavern, once a place of community gatherings and shared meals, had become a battlefield. Pockets of resistance fought desperately against armored Overlord troops. In the center, Leela led a small group protecting the retreat of wounded fighters, her movements a blur of precision and controlled fury. Across the cavern, unmistakable even among the chaos, stood Commander Vex. The armored figure directed the assault with calculated precision, advanced targeting systems, identifying and prioritizing threats within human efficiency. Fall back, Chris shouted to the defenders. Clear the central area. Understanding rippled through the Beastkin fighters, who began executing a coordinated withdrawal toward the protected tunnels. The Overlords, sensing victory, pressed forward into the clearing space, exactly as Chris had hoped. He positioned himself on a ledge overlooking the cavern, the EMP device humming as it charged to capacity. One shot, one chance to turn the tide. A commotion below caught his attention. Leela had been cut off from retreat, surrounded by Overlord soldiers. She fought with desperate intensity, but even her formidable skills were being overwhelmed by superior numbers and technology. Commander Vex approached her, weapon raised. "This one alive," the distorted voice commanded. "She has value." Chris's carefully calculated plan shattered at the sight. The EMP wasn't fully charged. Activating it now would reduce its effectiveness, potentially allowing some Overlord systems to remain operational. But waiting meant losing Leela. No calculation needed. Chris triggered the device. The electromagnetic pulse exploded outward in an invisible wave. Overlord weapons and armor systems failed simultaneously. Targeting computers, communication networks, even motorized joints in their advanced battle suits suddenly rendered useless. Commander Vex's armor locked mid-stride. The sophisticated technology transformed into an immobilizing prison. The cavern plunged into darkness as the settlement's lights failed along with everything else. For 3 heartbeats, perfect silence reigned. Then chaos erupted anew, but this time the advantage had shifted. Beastkin fighters, relying on natural night vision and physical abilities, fell upon the vulnerable overlords with vengeful precision. What had been a retreat became a rout as the invaders found themselves trapped in disabled armor. Facing opponents evolved for combat in darkness. Chris scrambled down from his position, the spent EMP device abandoned as he fought his way toward where he'd last seen Leela. The sounds of battle surrounded him. Growls, screams, the crunch of metal as beastkin claws tore through suddenly vulnerable armor. He found her standing over Commander Vex's immobilized form, claws poised for a killing strike. "Leela," he called, reaching her side. She turned to him, eyes luminous in the darkness, face spattered with blood, both hers and her enemies. The pulse worked. Better than expected, Chris confirmed, surveying the turning battle. They're in full retreat, where they can still move. Leela returned her attention to the helpless commander. "This one deserves death for what was planned for our people." Chris couldn't disagree, but something made him pause. "Dead, this is just another commander. Alive, this is intelligence, locations, plans, capabilities. Everything we need to protect, not just this settlement, but others." Leela considered this, the tactical advantage warring with justified vengeance. Finally, she nodded. "Prisoner, then. The elders will decide." As they secured the commander, emergency lights began to flicker on, backup systems Chris had wisely isolated from the main grid. In their glow, the extent of their victory became clear. Dozens of overlords captured or defeated. Others fled, abandoning equipment and wounded in their desperation to escape. The settlement had held. Hours later, as dawn broke outside their underground home, the full accounting began. Lives lost, injuries sustained, damage to their home. All painful, but far less than what total defeat would have meant. The prisoners, including Commander Vex, were secured in repurposed storage areas, their technology confiscated for study and potential adaptation. In the medical area, Chris found Leela receiving treatment for a deep gash across her shoulder. He sat beside her, his own injuries, minor by comparison, already bandaged. "The elders are questioning the commander," she informed him, wincing as the healer applied a sealing agent to her wound. "Already we have learned of 3 other settlements targeted for collection. We'll need to warn them," Chris said. "Establish some kind of communication network between the surviving communities." Leela nodded, then asked the question hanging between them. "And Garen?" Chris sighed, still demanding we should have surrendered, still convinced the overlords would have honored their agreement with him. "The punishment for betrayal is exile," Leela said quietly. "But in this case, that feels inadequate." Before Chris could respond, Eldertharn approached, his age frame somehow standing taller despite the exhaustion evident in his features. "The council has reached decisions," he announced. "The traitor Garen will be imprisoned until we can transfer him to the eastern settlement for judgment by a combined council. The Overlord Commander and key officers will be held for information and potential exchange for our captured over the years." "And the settlement?" Chris asked. "We rebuild," the elders stated simply. stronger than before, with new knowledge from our victory. He turned to Chris with solemn formality. The Council recognizes your contribution to our survival. What was begun as an accidental bond has proven true through action and sacrifice. You are clan now, not by ritual, but by right. The acknowledgement settled over Chris like a physical weight, responsibility and belonging intertwined. He glanced at Leela, seeing in her eyes a reflection of his own journey from outsider to defender, from accidental mate to chosen partner. Elder Tharn wasn't finished. The Council further proposes establishing a communication network between settlements, as you suggested. We have lived too long in isolation, making us vulnerable. That ends today. As the Elder departed to oversee other matters, Chris and Leela found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the medical area. Around them, their community began the process of recovery, clearing debris, repairing systems, tending wounds both physical and emotional. So, Chris said finally, "What happens now?" Leela considered the question, her amber eyes thoughtful. "Now we rebuild. Now we connect with others. Now we stop hiding and start living." She reached for his hand, her gesture no longer hesitant but confident. "Now we choose our path together, not because tradition demands it, but because we wish it." Chris intertwined his fingers with hers, realizing how natural the contact felt now. How right. "When I crashed here, I thought it was the worst luck imaginable. Stranded on a hostile world, caught in customs I didn't understand. And now," Leela prompted, echoing their conversation from before the battle. Chris smiled. "Now I think maybe it was the best thing that could have happened. I found something I never knew I was looking for." Leela's usually stoic expression softened into a genuine smile. "All because you fed me by hand." "Technically," Chris pointed out with a grin, "you're stuck with me for life now." "I can think of worse fates," Leela replied, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their community begin anew in the aftermath of victory. Outside, beyond the cave entrance, twin suns rose over the scarred landscape. The world remained harsh, dangerous, unforgiving, but no longer faced alone. What had begun with a simple act of kindness, offering food to an injured stranger, had transformed into something neither could have anticipated, a bond forged in crisis, tested in fire, and chosen in freedom. Mates for life, indeed, but on their own terms.